And thank you, Heather, for being here. My name is Eric North. I'm the new Assistant Professor of Urban and Community Forestry here at the University of Minnesota. Some of you may remember Gary Johnson, my predecessor. I think he's also on the call today. It's my pleasure to introduce Heather Byers. Heather and I met while I was working at the University of Nebraska, and she was a great supporter of the program. And I got to know her and her husband through their nursery work. And they just do some really cool stuff and have some great ways that they work with plants and developing good tree roots and seed collection. And I just have been very impressed with how they work and their contributions to supporting the industry and education of students. I usually ask them for their worst nursery products so I could show students root dysfunction. And I was always disappointed. The stock was always too nice, but I always appreciated to have the stock available for students to work with. So without further ado, Heather, thank you very much. And yeah, we're excited to hear what you have to say.
Okay. Thanks, Eric. I'm excited to talk to you guys about tree production today. I'm sure, it's going to be a lot of speaking to the choir with some of the stuff that I'll present. But I also love to kind of go back and forth. So if you guys have questions, please bring them up and we can kind of make a discussion out of it too. So for starters, my husband and I started our nursery in 2008, shortly after graduating from the University of Nebraska. And we just always had a passion for trees, for native trees in general. There was kind of that void within the industry of native trees were, just weren't being produced. It was all about the next cultivar that was coming out. So we kind of wanted to change that. We have more of I had a strong interest in ornithology and entomology, and it always would come back to the plants, that would support that Holden web of life, basically. So that's where we thought we could contribute to our environment by producing native trees. So we'll dive in. Let's see if I can get this. There we go. All right, so you guys all know this stuff, why trees are so important to us, but it really is the backbone to understand why we produce trees the way that we do. The main thing is, we need to get trees to make it to the next generation. And so often with our community trees, and what we're seeing is, storm damage and all those things are happening, but it also is coming back to the production method. So that's where if we first understand why trees are so important to us, then we can start to make better choices in the way that we produce them so that we can get them to do all these great things for our communities. We already know this, we're losing big trees. A lot of them are aging there, but we have so many outside pressures right now with insects and disease issues and monocultures. I mean, that's a lot of what it's coming down to is just the monocultures planted and insects, disease can just wipe right through it. But a lot of it is also aging. In the research done here at Nebraska, they've shown that there's a gap between trees just not quite making it into past like that 30 or 40 year mark. And that's where when they were digging into it, it was coming back to that nursery production. Here's some things that we can control. You guys know all this stuff, I'm sure. Just main things are proper species selection, siting and design, good nursery stock. That's the main thing I'm going to talk about today. The big thing is just treating our trees with dignity. They are individuals, they're organisms, and we can get the benefits from them if we treat them well. Basics, right? Okay, so why do we choose native trees? So I already kind of highlighted that, trees kind of start that web of life. They are the soul food, the habitat, all the good things that come from our trees providing for us. So the other big thing about native trees is choosing native trees that evolve in our conditions. And here in Nebraska, we have extremes on both ends. Like I was telling Eric when I first logged in, it's supposed to be 55 today and we're mid-20s all of next week. We're just all over the place all the time. We hit in October this year, we hit 18, I think, really quickly. And that had been after it'd been 60s all fall. So it's just our snaps are what are the hardest, I think, on our trees in general. But to me, I look at that as we're sitting on this pool of genetic trees that can withstand that. and and it can tolerate those temperature swings, the ice loads, the wind, all of those things. So I look at it as this great little pool of trees that could really survive anything, let alone their ability to provide all the great things that they provide. So we go out and we collect from native wild stands. We're really fortunate to kind of have a network of foresters that we work with that help us collect, and we purchase seed from, and some landowners that allow us access to collect. And this is my husband and my daughter out collecting Kentucky coffee tree from a wild stand that's here in Saunders County. And it's like a thicket of coffee tree. It's just crazy. It's beautiful. So, and this is a great big bur oak that we always go to. So we kind of have those staples that we like to go to, and not just in this little pocket. We expand out across the Midwest, so we're getting a wide genetics, and then we source those, or like on our tree list, we'll source what county that they're from, so it kind of gives an idea of the soils and the moisture and all of that. And I mean, I'm not quite sure about Minnesota, but here in Nebraska, it's from one side of the state to the other is completely different. So we kind of need to be mindful of those conditions. All right, so we know how important genetic diversity is, and adaptability and all of those good things. And this comes down to that monoculture planting again. And oftentimes we think about that we just need, that street that's all American elms. Well, maybe we should have been a little bit more diverse with species, but then it also comes down to genetic diversity, to where they're not all clonal. So I'm really passionate about that with the horticulture industry in general, and I'm a horticulturist, are really proud of producing the next plant, the next red thing, or the next purple thing, and then stamping a name on it. And I know that they feel that there's merit to that, but in the longevity of our environment and our communities, I think there's no purpose in that. They're pretty, which is great. But how about having our trees do a lot more for us than just that? So it has to also come down to genetic diversity within each tree. One, American elm seed grown next to another one might be able to withstand more, drought pressure than the next one next to it. And that just comes down to look at individual humans. I always think of that, siblings, how different one will be from another. We all have our own genetic code and diversity there. So I think that that's really important too, to not just say we need species diversity, but also that seed grown trees that offer that genetic diversity as well, and their ability to adapt with each scenario. So here's just another, Nebraska is just weird, but I'll hint on this really quick. So we were in extreme drought. You can see our state there. And 3 years later, we had extreme flooding, like all over. It was just crazy, just awful stuff. And then this is always kind of an interesting phenomenon, a heat burst. I don't know if you know much about this. At 5:10 in the morning, it jumped up to 99 degrees after being 73 at 3 a.m. So it's just these weird weather phenomena, and it's only getting more extreme, it seems like, year in and year out, where you think it's these, we had a 100-year flood, they called it 3 years ago or 5 years ago. And is that a 100-year flood now, or what is that going to be now? I mean, it's just more versatile, or not versatile, more erratic than what I think it has been in the past. So it's just really something to consider when we are choosing the trees that we're going to plant. And we all know this stuff, I'm sure. The good old autumn blaze maples and Calvary bears. So let's dive into talking about proper nursery stocks. So I kind of explained when it came down to some of the research being done as to why trees are not making it past 20 or 30 years, there was Eric Berg here in Nebraska, great man, did a lot of excavating. He got a grant for a air spade. And so he was digging out these trees that were declining to try and figure out what was going on. And it really, unfortunately, for nursery folk, it came down to us, it seemed like. Either there were stem girdling roots, they were buried too deep. There was just a whole gamut of things. And, in the 1950s, we mechanized nurseries. and they were able to produce more trees and, you know, faster, more efficient, you know, that's really what it came down to. And the quality really kind of lost its way of how many plants can we produce for, you know, all of that stuff. So the focus is getting back to higher quality nursery stock, because I think we're seeing the effects in our communities of these trees. So some examples, I mean, the root bound trees from the containers. I mean, this one here that's ideally what you want to see. Nice radial root growth coming out from the flare, you know, all within kind of that top 12 inches. That, you know, that's a little liner there. That's never going to revert. You know, you're never going to make anything about that. Once a root starts in a direction, you know, I think Alex Shigo said that once a root starts in a direction, it doesn't stop. You know, it continues to wind and wind and wind and go round and round. And that's not a problem right now for that tree, but it will be in 5, 10, 15 years from now when that is that tightly wound, like the stem girdling root that you see in the bottom there. So, and then when you look at ball and burlap trees and you are spading them out of a field where they've been growing for 4 or 5 years, you're leaving generally, you know, 50 to 75% of that root system back in the field. And then just all the open wounds that you've created and points of infection, and then all the energy that the tree has to send to seal all those wounds over, it, you know, just stunts it from being able to do any type of top growth. So that's always, you know, just kind of to me a step backwards. So tree selection, you know, I'm sure all of you guys know the big benefits of oaks. We love oaks. I mean, that's kind of our, you know, if anybody asks me what tree should I plant, we always start talking about what oak should you plant. You know, they're great selections. And I don't know if we need to go through all of these. I'm sure you guys are familiar with them. If anybody's got some favorite oaks, you know, shout them out. They're always good ones. And these are what, again, grow here in Nebraska. And we do a lot with like Nebraska, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas. So these are kind of what apply to us. But also, you know, like the hybrid oaks, we've been having some fun with those as well. Some ones I want to point out would be chinkapin and dwarf chinkapin. Those are some of my favorites. Dwarf chinkapin, we have a natural stand here in Nebraska down in Richardson County that is the most north and western native stand of that. And it's actually more like a shrubby oak. I mean, you know, it grows to 15, 20 feet tall maybe. But that's a really cool wild stand along a hillside there. So that's a good genetic source for us. Shingle oak, I don't feel like gets toted enough as it should for its number one thing, great attribute I've seen lately. We've been struggling with a lot of herbicide damage, both in our communities and on the land that we help, you know, manage or plant. You know, we have a lot of landowners that we work with, and everybody seems to struggle with herbicide damage. I don't know if that's something up north that you guys are as well. Sometimes it seems like the communities, you know, you want to blame it on agriculture, but it seems like the communities are having just as much trouble because of all the turf, you know, just the chemicals being put on lawns and things like that. So, but that's why I want to bring up shingle oak is we're not seeing any effects of herbicide damage on shingle oaks. You know, you know, what you see on red oak and burr, they always seem to take it really hard. But shingle just seems to shrug their shoulders at it. So that's been kind of a good one. And it's a nice small little acorn that blue jays just love. So it's another good one. So I kind of highlighted on those. There's a little bit more about them. Chinkapin is about as drought tolerant as it comes, and it rocky soils, sandy soils, it just does great. Dwarf chinkapin, that's kind of an example. See how it's nice and shrubby. It's a cool little plant. I've also seen it. So some want to be shrubby and multi-stem, but others want to be single stem. So it actually makes for a really nice front yard tree. You know, it's 15, 20 feet tall, and it's just a cute little oak. It starts setting acorns by year 3, so it's a really young producer. So that's why a lot of habitat, you know, hunters groups, or I sold a whole bunch of them to a Montessori school because she wanted all the little acorns for the kids, you know, just that textile, and with it being lower to the ground, right at, you know, eyes reach. So that was a fun one. Chestnut oak, everybody's familiar with that one now. That was the urban tree of the year a couple years ago. That's a ridgetop tree, so that's another really good tough one that just is underutilized, I think. And just some other, besides oak, lots of other good ones. Ironwood, I don't know if you guys are very familiar with ironwood, and I believe it's native up into that area. Great understory tree, but here in Nebraska, it surprises us when I mean, this is an urban tree on a park setting out in the full sun, and it does great. I would have thought it would have had more trouble with it scorching, but we collect that one out of Douglas County, so maybe with it being a native source, or that really local source, it's just become more tolerant to that. And Kentucky coffee tree, love that one. That's that's a good one. I'm sure everybody agrees. That's a great tree. Okay, so relict oak or Burr Oak Canyon. So Burr Oak Canyon is out near McCook, Nebraska, which is in the southwest region of Nebraska, just north of the Kansas border. So like extreme heat, extreme drought, not a lot of trees in this whole area. It's just, grassland. It's the prairie, basically. So this Burr Oak Canyon sits on private ground, but it is a 3-acre canyon that is out literally in the middle of nowhere. You have to drive, it's about an hour drive from McCook, all across cattle panels, just prairie, basically, pasture ground, and there is not a tree in sight. And when you're first driving out there, you start to think, is this really happening? Are we really going somewhere? Because I do not see a single tree. And this whole canyon sits below the horizon. So it's so, so cool. And you just kind of fall upon it. And there it is. And they think that there's a mix of Burr Oak, Post Oak, and Gamble Oak in here. And these trees are old as it comes. It's just a really, really unique population and very isolated. They originally think that the whole area was forested at one time, and then with with fire would come across, it would, eventually break them all down. Or it just burned off the whole population. But this little canyon survived, just kind of out of that relict population of the bigger group. That's why the name relict applies. So we have the rights to go and collect there from the landowner, and we collect a royalty so that we could send back a royalty for reforestation in here. And then we send back little seedlings to do like a replanting. And because there's not a lot of regeneration within the canyon, he does let his cattle graze down there because there's a spring down there. So he's not willing to keep them out. So we do go down and replant little seedlings, and we fence them in. But it's just a really cool story. The university has gone out and done digs out there. There's just some really cool artifacts. So it's a really neat place. I saw my first porcupine when we were out there. It's very neat. So they've done a lot of studies out there and digs, and big tree groups like our nursery group goes out like every probably 3 or 4 years. It's just a really unique place. So I guess from the nursery standpoint, so the seed that we collect out there, we name it the relict oak. And then like our local community foresters think that there's a lot of potential for this tree because of the genetic diversity there to be an urban tree because of the reflective heat and all those good things. So it's being trialed as a urban tree here on the eastern side of the state. And on this side in the nursery, we see crazy amounts of growth on it. I think it doesn't know what to do with all this water that we have. So it's a happy little tree. Okay, so let's go into nursery production then. So the main thing about a healthy, vibrant community tree, if you want to say community tree, is that it has lots of root tips. So root tips are what are doing all of the water and nutrient absorption. So the more root tips that you have on a tree, the healthier and the faster it's going to grow, because it has more points of entry for all the water and nutrients. So the key became, and I learned this going through school, and then also I came out learning a lot from Dr. Whitcomb. I really loved all of his stuff, and just wanting to know more about how the trees function and how does it all work. And Dr. Whitcomb started by digging up healthy trees, and starting to figure out what is key there. And he found that's where these root tips come in. But the main thing is that you can see here in the bottom left of your screen, the main thing that he came back to was that there was a high amount of roots within the first 6 inches of the root collar. So that means you didn't have this big taproot and then roots going way out and then root branching going way out on the sides. You needed a high intense massive roots right at the root collar, right at that initial junction of roots. So the main way to get that is by starting that root branching early. So that's where seed production comes in. Is by the more that you can encourage those highly fibrous roots in the beginning and the young stages of the tree, the better off you're going to be. So we really focus a lot of work into the propagation and the initial start of our trees and young trees. So here's this little seedling in the bottom left would be probably maybe 3 or 4 weeks old there. So you can see that root tip grew down, and we use the air pruning containers that an air will kill the tip of a root and it forces the auxin backwards. So then that's where you get the root branching. That's what's so important about that. And see all that nice horizontal branching going on. Then that middle picture, that's of a 1 gallon, I believe, pulled out after a year. You can see all that nice fibrous roots. And then that's a 7 gallon off to the right there. And same thing, lots of root tips. So that's our main focus. And again, with traditional methods, you get a lot of this circling. And circling, and if you're ever growing in a container, you risk having circling. So that's where timing is so important. So some people, I've seen other growers say, well, yeah, I'll use the air pruning pots. Well, the problem with the air pruning, or it's not a problem, it's a great thing, is that you get all this root branching going on. As soon as the root touches the air, it starts branching, but you get the back growth going on and where you get branching. So you get all this accelerated growth, which in turn means you're getting accelerated growth of a root system, and it's going to fill out that pot that much faster. And so part of the problem is they think, a nursery might think that you can grow it at the same timing or the same production schedule as traditional grown pots, but in fact, it's twice the speed. So you need to be on top of those plants that much more of getting them shifted up in a really timely manner. And it really takes paying attention to the plants and not the calendar or the, if it's week 39, it's time to shift. Well, no, they needed it at week 31. So it's really paying attention to that and learning from the plants, because what we found is they'll stall out. If they start circling or those roots begin getting woody, they'll stall out and you won't get any more top growth. They just kind of sit and, oh, I'm sorry, I just saw there was some chat. Oh, good. Okay, so the gravel bed, we used to have a gravel bed. Oh gosh, probably 6 or 7 years ago. And it was a phenomenal way to produce trees. The trees we would pull out of there were beautiful. It just amazing root systems. The problem that we had with it was the contractors or the cities or anybody that we wanted to work with could not handle how delicate that was. We had a couple times where we had pulled out 40 trees out of the gravel bed ready to be picked up the next day, and we got a 3-inch rain that night, and that we weren't supposed to get rain. And so then they halt the whole project for a week. And it's so hard to hold that material and not let it dry out. And just all those, it just was really challenging. And a lot of the contractors we worked with were scared of it and just didn't want to deal with it. So that's really when we started putting more focus into, and we trialed into a lot of things, but that's where we were seeing the grow bags, the Rootmaker grow bags were being really efficient and producing a really good tree, very similar to a gravel bed, but much more forgiving when it came holding and planting time and all that stuff. So that's kind of where we moved our focus into that. But yes, I love the gravel bed. It was a great way to grow trees. Okay, so what are grow bags? And they are really coming about now with a lot of other alternatives on the market. We really focus on the Rootmaker method. The reason being is it's the only one, and I've trialed all of them because I'm always open to doing something better or different. I always have an open, I guess, window to it. But Rootmaker, out of anybody, has the research. And that's just key to me. Just to have the science behind it. And he's got 40 plus years, I mean, almost 50 now years of research that has gone into these. And a lot of his trials, it's Dr. Whitcomb that did all this out of the University of Oklahoma. And he has multiple books out about it. But even some of the trials that he did, the containers that he didn't patent, those are now on the market, which is interesting. Like somebody else picked up that design or saw his design that he basically, threw by the wayside. He wasn't happy with the results he was getting, and somebody else picked it up, and now you can purchase that container. But I just go back to that, the research that he's done, the effort he's put into it to really figure out what's going on with roots, and the way that they react to air pruning and constriction and all of that good stuff. So the way that it essentially works, so you have three ways that you can get a root to branch. Essentially, you have to kill the tip, and you can do that either with air, with mechanical pruning, or with chemical, something like a copper that would burn off the tip. So to me, with mechanical pruning, yes, you sometimes have to do that if you're tearing into a tree, but I don't like to have to do that because it's opening a wound and then it's diverting the energy of that tree to seal that wound over. So the more often that we can use something like air pruning or constriction works as well. And that's the way that the bags work. The more forward going you're going with that tree of moving forward with its growth. So the air pruning is strategically, those black pots that you see there has all the air holes in it. Those are all strategically placed with the way the pot's designed for the way the root grows down. And roots always branch backwards 4 inches is what he found. So we use that when we think about that 4-inch rule with every step that we take of bumping up our plants. We do it in a container that's 4 inches, like a 1 gallon to a 7 gallon, because then we have 4 inches all the way around the outside of that bag for that increased root branching. So it's basically getting 4 more inches every time you shift up. So it works pretty slick. And then the way that the bag works, and again, this is the only bag on the market that does this. There's lots of other fabric bags out there. And when I ask each one of them that present us to a reason to buy their bags, how do they work? Why do they work? The way that Rootmaker, and they call it the root trapper bag, the roots actually tap into the sides of it. So if you hold that fabric up and look at it, there's little holes punched in it. Again, very strategic. And it's just the right size that a root does not hit it and circle. It hits it and taps into it. So, and again, through constriction, it makes it branch backwards. So you're getting that increased root branching backwards. So it works beautifully. And then, yes, you do have to rip the bag off, and that does rip off some of those root tips. But again, that's those really fibrous root tips that are not, it's not a great big wound, but it does, and they root in so quickly too that it really takes off. And then essentially what you're getting with all those increased root tips is all that increased growth on top. And I'll show a picture of that, of kind of the growth that we can achieve with this. So this is a 2-year-old sycamore. This was in a 5-gallon Rootmaker. And you can see that nice fibrous root system. It's just like a head of hair. Like they're just beautiful. And we root washed that out, or just hosed it all out so that we could really tease that out and see how much of a root system of a mass that we had there. And again, these plants, they're just going to take off. I mean, the benefit of growing in this system essentially is so that when they are transplanted, I mean, that's the big thing. Wild trees, native trees, were never meant to be transplanted. And that's if that's what we intend to do, then we need to figure out the right way to do it and a good way to do it so that when they get to their final, park or street tree or, or whatever it is, or shade tree or, shade on a yard tree, then they're ready to go, that they can just explode, they can root in, just transplant beautifully. So essentially that is that's the whole point of this. All right, so just a quick kind of how we go through our production system. You know, we start in the greenhouse. We do about 20,000 seedlings every spring. We move them out. You know, they last about 8 weeks in the greenhouse before we bump them up. And I, you know, have a lot of other growers that'll say that, like, oh, these are only a couple inches tall. Like, you know, what are you doing? You need them a foot tall before you bump them out. But essentially, we can encourage, by moving them on, by shifting them faster, we can encourage more and more growth. Because you're just allowing more rooting space. I mean, that's essentially all it is the rooting space. So for an example, so these seedlings right here were planted out in May. These would have been sown into the greenhouse in March. So these were just 2 months old after germination. So here is by July, they put on maybe another 8 or so feet or so inches, you know, as they're filling out that pod is basically what I see. And then once they start hitting those the air holes on the sides of the pot and you're getting that root branching, that's essentially what happens here between July and August, is you get this shot of growth, this huge shot of growth. And we can get 4 increments of growth on our oaks. Like these are red oaks here in one season. So the first one will only be maybe 3 inches. The second one will be 4 inches, maybe. The third one, maybe a foot. And the second one, we can get, you know, 12 to 18 inches of top growth going on, to where these will top out at 4 feet tall by the end of, you know, by fall. So it's really slick. And then usually here in August, we'll take off the skin of this house or the poly so that they can start hardening off on their own. And, you know, because the next thing then is to develop bud set for next year. So we want them to harden off and put their energy into that bud set. So, but I've been really pleased with this amount of growth. And again, it's not the nitrogen, it's not fertilizer, it all goes down to the root system. It really does. When we focus on that, we can get this type of growth. So here's a 1 gallon. So this would have came out of the greenhouse again in May. And this is in July is when we start shifting out of our 1 gallons into our 7. So all we do basically all season long is shift. It's just from one to another. And it's species by species. We won't take all of the 1 gallons. We'll say, oh, you know, my production manager will come and say, well, the red oaks are ready. You know, should we at least get, you know, we'll get the red oaks done today and tomorrow. And, you know, so we really watch each species of tree to know when they're ready. So essentially you take this 1 gallon and you can just barely see there's a new shot of growth starting up there on the top there. So it's ready to shoot again. So it's grown, it's probably started here at the bottom. We got another shot. So that's probably its 4th shot of growth starting. That's when we'll shift it into a 7-gallon bag then. So that's what you see happening here. And essentially this is what it finishes out at. This is our 7-gallon grow bag. It's about a 3/4 to 1 inch caliper tree. It's definitely our most popular size, just because a lot of the communities that we work with or the landowners, they want to be able to handle them themselves. So I mean, I can carry a 7-gallon in each hand. It's about a 6 foot tall tree, but nice and branched. I mean, essentially that's what we're looking for. Nice, strong leader. But we can, that amount of difference is in 2 years. So this 7-gallon tree you're looking at would be a 3-year-old tree, basically. So then they get moved out here into our grow bag. It's a bag and pot system. So our bags are made to fit into these socket pots so that we can spread them out and keep them pruned and all of that good stuff throughout the season. And then they're in place then over the winter. There's really no maintenance after that, you know, for protecting them. They get acclimated and they've got to go through winters, you know, right there at the nursery and really with no protection. So to make sure that they can survive. So the other big thing then when we talk about, you know, we've talked a lot about root system, is to talk about the top. So you can see the acorn here. This is the 3-gallon. This is probably by the end of the season. So we really focus on not only the root system, but on micronutrients so that we're developing a strong caliper. A lot of the trees that'll come into Nebraska come from Oregon, as with anywhere. That's, you know, the big nursery state, but there's hardly any wind there. So they have these beautifully straight, tall trees. hardly any, flare developed or stem caliper developed, and they're just lollipops that blow in our wind and look ridiculous. So our big thing is to really focus on stem caliper development and growth before height growth. So the main thing that Wickham talked about that contribute to stem caliper growth are those lower limbs and lower leaves. They directly, all of their solar panels that they collect, all of that energy goes directly into stem caliper growth. So we'll leave lower limbs on longer than traditional nurseries will. They're real quick to limb them up. I'm sorry. They'll be real quick to limb them up and get that base, bottom limb set on a tree. Well, we leave those lower limbs on longer so that we can really develop that stout tree. I mean, we get 60 mile an hour winds or nothing. That's just a normal Wednesday. So we need trees that can really stand up to that. So that's where that comes in. So, I mean, here's a good example there of, nice stout tree, and it's not whippy. That's our main thing. So when I talk about oaks to people, and they always say, "Oh, oaks are too slow. I don't want to plant an oak." This is a great example. I had this little lady. She's fantastic, and she was willing to try it. She goes, "Well, I guess it doesn't matter anyway. I'm always planting for the next generation anyway." I'm like, exactly. So she took this. It was a 7-gallon burr oak, and we fit it into her vehicle. She sent me this picture 4 years later, and I say planted in Omaha on here because Omaha is tough soils, and everybody knows that. It is heavy clay, just muck, and just, yeah, it's tough soils. So for an oak to do well in that, a burr oak especially, I was really, really pleased with that. And I attribute this to, she didn't do any pruning. She left the lower limbs on and that nice wide mulch bed around the tree. But look at the growth on that in 4 years. And that was probably a 5 or 6 foot tree when she purchased it. And I just go back to, they root in so well and just really take off. And I think that thoughts like this help me to encourage homeowners or neighborhoods or communities to have incentive that you don't always have to plant the fast growing things, when everybody just wants the elms or the ash, well, hopefully not ash, but maples that are fast growing. Well, that really limits our diversity. So if we can encourage people that, it's okay to plant an oak, and look, you can get good growth on an oak, that then improves our whole community with adding that piece of diversity in. So that's, where we can help out, is to have quality stock to be able to provide that will then benefit the whole community. So, and essentially when you talk about then the planting, because that comes into play too, making sure it's properly planted. And I'm sure all of you guys know all this stuff. It's probably nothing that I need to cover, but it's just, always watching for that root flare. And that's the big thing that comes down to, like with our nursery stock, we always really pay attention to that. And what's great about growing from seed is right where that root flare is because of where the seed is. So where it's supposed to be. And the root flare doesn't really develop until a couple of years into the tree, but because of where that seed, where it all came out, that's the soil level. That's where that it is. So it helps us to always keep a very close watch on that and to know they're properly planted. So essentially, yes, we're always planting for the next generation. Trees that the kids can climb. This is our 10-year-old here in the orange dress, and this tree was planted when she was born. And so it's already to the point that she can climb it. And I love that. They love climbing that tree. So essentially that's what we're doing, is it's all about the next generation. And with that, oh, this has my husband's name on it. No, I'm Heather, not Brian, but yeah, that's kind of what I know. So let me look at the questions here. Okay. Do you practice or have you tried root pruning at the germination stage by pre-germinating seeds or acorns and root pruning the emerging radicals before planting to transition from the tap root to a branched root system and increase root branching from the start? Yes, essentially that's what we're doing. So the Rootmaker trays, which I didn't have a close-up of that. Let me go back. That initial picture. Oh, there we go. So that initial picture that showed the root trays, that root branch or that air root pruning starts right away, basically at day 3. Once that root can get started and tap down, it'll hit air because it's within that 4 inches. And then right away you get that root branching. So if you went back to that photo I showed of, I wonder if I can get back to that.
Heather, just to let you know, you stopped sharing your screen. So if you were trying to highlight something you were looking at, we can't see it. We just see you, which is also nice, but just letting you know.
Okay, here, I'll share it again here. I'm sorry. Okay, so this picture down here, can you see it now?
Yep, we can see that.
So the picture in the bottom left, so that essentially is the air root pruning starting on that tap root. So you can see the tap root goes down and it's 4 inches and it gets air pruned right away. So that's happening within the first week after germination. So right away that tap root's getting eliminated and it's becoming a fibrous root system, which is essentially, a fibrous root system is, your bottomland species, or that naturally have it, like ash and maple. They naturally have those things, and that's why they're really easy to transplant, and that's why they're so heavily planted, because they've survived well with our growing systems that we've used the last 30 years and being able to be transplanted into our communities, whereas oaks are always a lot harder, and more of like our hickories and things they don't tolerate that as well because of that tap root system. But by eliminating that so quickly in the tree's life, we're evolving it into a fibrous root system from the get-go. So I think there's a lot of advantage to that. Let me see. Oh, I can't get back to see the questions. I'm gonna have to stop sharing again.
I think there were questions looking at how you would use bur oaks maybe in southwestern Minnesota, which is really kind of the start of the Great Plains.
Yeah. Well, absolutely. I mean, bur oaks grow native all the way up into Canada. So I'm sure that you have wild stands of bur oaks right around there, wouldn't you say, Eric, that you could collect from and kind of.
Yeah, you could definitely.
Yeah. We have really rocky, sandy soil. There's certain species that can adapt better to rocky or sandier soils when it comes to oaks in general. If you're talking about oaks, the chestnut oak particularly would do well on something like that. Black oak actually would do really well on a tough soil, like a rocky soil. But when you say sandy, does that mean that it's well draining? I need to think about kind of those things too. Is there a high water table? Is that just not even existing? But also walnuts. Somebody said walnuts. Yeah, so we do a lot of the juglans and the Caria species because both of those respond well to this growing system. So it's another way to offer those species to get wider planted. A surprise or a big one for our local municipalities has been pecan. They've been really excited to use more pecan for street trees because of just the nice straight vertical growth. So that's been really exciting because normally we just offer those to landowners and hunters and things like that. But that's been a nice one to think about as an urban tree. Species that have issues with establishment, in my experience, anything that has issues with establishment comes down to the site. If we have a construction site or anything that has poor drainage, because that's kind of our biggest issue here in Nebraska on the eastern side anyways, is poor drainage from there's so much construction going on, and that's a lot of the replanting that like if we do a conservation planting or something, that's the issues that we have. And I do think that having a strong fibrous root system really helps adjust to that and root in that much faster when it's a tough site. But otherwise, it just comes down to picking the right tree, right species for the site, really.
I don't know if you saw this, Heather, but there's a question about propagating of blackjack oaks.
Yeah. Oh, I must have missed that one. Yeah, blackjack. It's essentially the same procedure. I mean, all oaks are the same. Starting with propagation all the way through. Blackjacks, we grew blackjacks 1 year because we sent them back out to Colorado. They sent us the seed, and we grew them, and then we shipped them back out to them as little 1 gallons for reforestation. But they're not native to our region here. It's more Colorado and the Western, Utah, that direction. So we don't grow them year in and year out, but we have grown them before, and I haven't seen any difference in them. They're do you have do you have wild blackjacks up there?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah, unless somebody else has seen some, but not that I'm aware of. There's a question. I'll kind of help you as you're answering questions so that you don't have to scroll so much. A question from Mike. See from your website that you grow a variety of trees and shrubs. What, if any, is your interest in growing understory plants for forest restoration? Mm-hmm.
Yep, we do a lot of that. We'll grow the amelanchers, the pawpaws. We do understory trees, and that's where even Ostrea comes in. I had shown that one earlier. I know I really focused on overstory trees for this talk, but yep, we do a lot of mix of the understory as well. Probably not as strongly focused on that side of it because I feel like the need right now is in that backbone, large maturing shade tree kind of sector. But as the layers come into a planting, those are just equally as important. So yeah, we do offer those as well. There's just not as a wide variety of them.
Yeah, and John, let's see, just scroll a little bit. Let's see, John asked, did you root prune, tap prune the oaks you propagated in your gravel bed? Bottom line, did you have success in the gravel bed with oak in general? So up here, we've had some issues with growing oaks in gravel beds and getting them to work out. So I think the question John Goodfellow is asking is, can you grow oaks and how did you do it?
Okay.
We want to
well, I would be interested in what was before, what were the steps before you put it into the gravel bed? If you ordered a bare root tree from a nursery and stuck that in the gravel bed, yes, you're going to have trouble. Anytime a bare root or a bur oak is bare rooted, they just don't like it. They tend to dry out. They're just too sensitive. And so there's that old saying that you get the mouse ears the first year on them, and then maybe they'll take off the second year. So that's not a great way to produce oaks. The way that we did it with our gravel bed is we propagated them in the greenhouse, just like I showed in step 1 and 2, where basically we grew them in the air pruning pots as the trays and then moved them into the 1 gallons. And the 1 gallon for us is so important. I mean, any direction that we go with them after that, but they have to make it through that 1 gallon stage because that's where you're creating like that 6 inches of nice solid root mass. And so that's just key. And from there, you can either plant them in the ground, you can put them in a gravel bed, you can pot them up into a bag, whatever. But so we would take them from that 1 gallon, and they would be probably a 5-month-old tree by July or August, and we put them right into the gravel bed. So we just shake off all of the potting mix. We didn't really root wash them particularly. We just shook it all off as best we could, and then put them into the gravel bed. And our gravel bed was in trenches in the ground. I know some people just pile them on top of the ground, but we did a trench so that it was better insulated for our winters. That was kind of our concern, is that we needed that good insulation for that root system. So we had a trench that we came with a backhoe. So it was like 2 feet wide and 2 feet deep. And it was just the backhoe would scoop out trenches, and then we could put a drip line right down it, but then we'd put the trees right in it. And we lined the trench with a fabric. But then we just pull them right out in probably 2 years, 3 years maybe. So basically as a 6-foot tree.
Just to add to that, Mike had a comment that on the oaks and gravel beds, a project at Cloquet Forestry Center, which is up closer to Duluth, Heather, for you, if you're familiar where Duluth is.
Okay, yeah.
Showed benefits of seedling oaks in gravel beds, more fibrous root systems. So so seedlings is things to focus.
Okay,
But
so not the bare root trees going into them. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's where maybe folks have had problems as bare root, but Mike was saying
Yes.
with seedlings, it's working pretty well. Jeff asked, is your focus on retail or wholesale sales? Do you do any contract growing for municipalities?
Yeah. So we can talk about that too, the contract growing. We do a lot of that with our local municipalities here. We also work with the city of Des Moines, the city of Cheyenne, where we've set up contracts. It works so well for both parties because they tell us kind of what their next wave of planting that they want to do for 2022, we'll say, is kind of what we're working on. And they'll say, here's what we want to focus on next is going to be, these 5 species. We want this many. We're going to do it as either street tree planting, or they're going to give them away to, homeowners, or there's lots of different avenues that they can go. But then we'll just contract grow that. And we'll, basically tell them, okay, well, we can have that finished out at this size or this size by then. Which would you prefer? And it works really nice because they're able to get the species that they want to continue to do the diversifying and the goal setting the goals that they've set for their community, and to continue on that path versus buying off the shelf and buying, whatever is available. And then we're able to grow particularly for a community. So it's a win-win on both ends. We haven't had a bad situation yet with the community, and we've been working with communities for probably 8 years now. We do a little bit of retail as well, or we could just call it direct sales because it's not really homeowners, it's more landowners, people that want to reforest, or nonprofits that have acquired ground and want to reforest it, or hunters, stuff like that is mostly who we work with. But we do wholesale as well, to contractors, that have gotten the projects for the communities. But my biggest focus, or the area that I feel like we're most effective and that I feel the most connection to, is working with communities and seeing, and with the neighborhoods, and seeing kind of their goals that they set for the community, and then, just being able to be a part of that. So that's kind of where my joy is.
So excuse me, a follow-up to that, Jeff was asking, what's the largest size trees you grow? 1.5-inch caliper, for instance.
Mm-hmm. So our largest tree is a 15-gallon grow bag, or root trapper bag, which is 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches in size. And the reason being that we stop at that size is because the research has shown, Dr. Whitcomb showed, that if you transplant a tree at 5 years and younger, it has a much higher survivability rate. So basically a 15-gallon or 1.5 inch caliper tree for us is 5 years old. So that's where we stop. We don't go up to a 25-gallon because it would be an older tree. And again, it just comes back to long-lived trees, so if the research shows that our survivability is going to drop off, then we're going to stop at this size. So that's the reason we choose to do that.
Hey, can you hear me, Heather?
Yes.
Eric, I hope you don't mind. I do a quick question this fashion, but so do you have, obviously we're all familiar with climate change, and are you taking that into account at all for future production? Looking at neonatives and things like that. Is that something on your radar? Maybe you already have been doing that, but.
Yeah, we've been branching out outside of kind of our standard natives that we grow to kind of expand into some of the southern, like Buckley oak. That doesn't grow native here in Nebraska now, but it is native into Kansas. And we have a source out in Fort Collins, Colorado, that they have Buckley oaks growing out there. So that's one that we're trialing. So we did we worked in association with the university to do an environmentally adaptive trees grant, to where we really tried trees that naturally do not grow here, but they're on the edge, that on their native edge. So we played around with that, and out of that trial came maybe a handful that we added to our standard list to try and, add, plant more of in our communities that would suffice. But yeah, you made a good point. You have to kind of think outside. Just if we really only grew natives to Nebraska, we would only grow bur oak, hackberry, and cottonwood. I mean, that's all that's naturally native here. This is a prairie state. I think they said 70% of our whole state has been planted. So again, it's good to think outside just your state lines, and trees don't follow government lines. It's the region. So, but yeah, that was a good point to always be thinking forward.
There was another question from that said, have you considered growing Gamble oak?
Yeah, we grow Gamble oak. Yeah, we grow that now. We send most of it back to the western side of the state. But that's a good one. That's just another little shrubby oak, basically.
Great. We just have a couple minutes left before we're at 11. If there's any last kind of questions for Heather that anyone would like to ask.
I see the elm varieties, the DED resistant. That's one that we've been putting more attention into. We have a selection out of Hastings, Nebraska that we grow that's a American elm that is the only one left standing there. They think there's some resistance there. We can't say it's resistant, but it is a truly native one, one of a lone, it's the lone one left of a larger population. So we've been propagating off of that one and just calling it Hastings elm. And, our communities here are interested in replanting that. But as far as the others, like Princeton, we do grow that one. I think that's a really nice one. I've been really pleased with that. Some of the crosses are pretty wild. I don't know if there is a lot of longevity to those species, like things like Triumph. And we've grown Triumph and Frontier because, again, our communities needed elms to plant, so we were trying to find the best ones. And those two are nice, but they're wild, and you really have to stay on top of the pruning of them. So I wonder if that's sustainable from a community perspective of being able to stay on top of those. But the true American elms, I would love to find more of those, because that Princeton's nice, Hastings. We also had a group out of Illinois send us some seed. I don't remember what they called that one off the top of my head, but we did grow that for them and send it back for some trials that they were doing. So that might be one that we can watch for. So just some other true Americans that we can replant again.
I think we have maybe one last question here. Now a couple others coming in right at the end. Okay, so what's your procedure for germinating acorns? If you can answer that real quick, and then if there's maybe just a second left, you can answer kind of how large is your operation in terms of acreage.
Sure. We just throw the seed down in some wooden trays first that have some metal mesh on the bottom. And then we put them in the greenhouse. It maybe takes a week or two before they start to germinate. And then we go through, we basically scroll it on and go through and dig through those trays, find anything that's germinating and start putting them into the production trays. And then the Rootmaker trays are 32 or 18 cell trays, and we fill them that way. And then they grow in there for about 6 to 8 weeks into those trays. And our nursery is about 15 acres right now. We just slowly add to it every year, but we want to keep it manageable. So, but it's a good, comfortable size.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Heather. We greatly appreciate your time and expertise. And I'm sure I'm sure if people wanted to contact you, if there's a couple other questions, or if they're interested in more of your work, I'm sure you'd be happy. Is that true?
Definitely.
Is that a true statement? Excellent.
Absolutely. Yeah. Here, I'll put my email address in. I always enjoy talking trees. So yeah, feel free to email anytime.